Welcome to Press TV's news review, everyone. Russia has expressed concern over the presence of Turkish forces and weaponry in northwestern Syria. Russia's defense ministry said the presence of Turkish troops, as well as the transport of weapons and ammunition in Idlib province, is making the situation in a volatile region much worse. This came after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan threatened to hit Syrian forces anywhere in the Arab country if Turkish soldiers are hurt again. Escalation comes amid ongoing joint operations by Syrian and Russian forces against terror groups in Idlib. Over a dozen Turkish soldiers have been killed as they're trying to push to block the Syrian army's advance in the area.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has threatened to hit Syrian army in northern Syria if attacks on Turkish soldiers continue. Erdogan said he is determined to push Syrian army forces behind Turkish observation posts by end of February and warned Syrian government forces to retreat. If not, Erdogan threatened to take Turkey's operation beyond Sochi agreement area. Erdogan also noted that the planes shelling Idlib will no longer be able to move freely in the region, assuring that Ankara will no longer rely on empty promises.
We will do this by any means necessary, by air or ground. The Syrian government will pay a very heavy price for attacking Turkish troops in Idlib. If there is the smallest injury to our soldiers on the observation posts or other places, I'm declaring from here that we will hit the regime forces everywhere from today, regardless of Idlib's borders or the lines of the Sochi agreement.
Turkish president said the Syrian government's complete control over Syria could threaten Turkey's security and stability. Meanwhile, a Turkish delegation is heading to Moscow to discuss the latest with Russian officials after information coming from the presidential palace noted that a phone call took place between Turkish and Russian presidents.
Turkish-Russian relationship will not be affected by these developments. The situation in Idlib is complicated. However, I know for sure that an agreement will be reached between Ankara and Moscow. Of course, Russia will have to force the Syrian government to stop the attacks and make a new agreement for Idlib. If that's necessary for a conflict, would benefit no one.
U.S. Special Envoy to Syria James Jeffrey spoke to journalists upon leaving Ankara late on Tuesday, sympathizing with Turkey, saying Ankara is encountering a great threat in Idlib. Ankara has set up 12 military observation posts across Idlib as part of the 2018 agreement with Moscow to create a de-escalation zone aimed at ending fighting between the Syrian government and rebel forces. Observers say now with the latest advancement of Syrian forces in the area, it seems that Turkey and Syria are heading towards a possible conflict, but whether or not the conflict can be resolved through talks remains to be seen. Rashan Saglam, Press TV, Istanbul.
And now joining us for this news review is Daniel Lazer, journalist and author out of New York, and Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I guess we'll start there in Bristol with you, Tony. Things were bad between Ankara and the Kurds before, and now it could be much more serious. It could be between Ankara and Damascus. Your thoughts on what's going on in Idlib?
Well, isn't it fascinating for President Assad of Syria? Every time there is trouble in the north of his country, he seems to be facing a different enemy. One disappears, another one pops up, and this time it's Turkey. It's a little bit cheeky of Erdogan to start telling the Syrian President Assad what to do in his own country, like saying things like, well, you better not attack me in your country, otherwise there'll be trouble for you. I wonder what Erdogan would say if there were Syrian troops in Turkey saying the same thing to the Turkish leader, that threatening him within his own country with their own armed forces. This is a real brinksmanship that Erdogan is doing here. He's also talking about the area around Idlib and north of there as a de-escalation zone, and yet what he's actually doing is escalating the tensions. We've got a lot of civilians being killed and injured in and around Idlib, and rather than allow the home forces, the Syrians' own Syrian Arab army, to finally mop up these final dregs of the ISIS and al-Sham terrorists, what Erdogan is starting to do is actually reinforce them, bringing in ammunition and more weapons in order to allow the terrorists to continue fighting in Idlib. So let's not forget, of course, that Turkey, despite its differences sometimes with the United States, particularly after the previous or the U.S. government apparently attempted to even kill Erdogan in an attempted coup a few years ago, that they're still part of NATO. And so there's been a lot of, I suppose, opportunism from Erdogan in trying to grab land, grab resources and grab territory in Syria. But it really is taking the biscuit in order to say to Assad that you dare not fight us within your own territory, because he's clearly backing the terrorists, he's backing the rebels, and he's stopping peace in Idlib, which is actually, if he was to pull his troops out, stop supplying weapons into Idlib, Idlib would almost certainly fall in quite a short period of time, and this would be the beginning of the end of the Syrian so-called civil war, which actually has been a Western intervention in Syria in order to try and regime change.
And Daniel, how do you interpret things on the ground in Syria's Idlib right now?
Well, I agree totally with the previous speaker. I mean, the only thing I would emphasize is that Turkey has been involved in the Syrian civil war since 2011, when it emerged as an important sponsor and conduit for Saudi and U.S. arms that were flowing to jihadi rebels in Syria. So the only thing that's changed recently is that now Turkey has inserted its own troops into Syria. But otherwise, it's the same flagrantly illegal invasion of another country's sovereignty, and that Erdogan is extraordinarily arrogant and demanding that Assad back off when Assad is on his own home ground. And the person that he has a right to be there in Idlib, and Erdogan, according to international law, has no right whatsoever. But apparently Erdogan is now in the grips of some kind of neo-Ottoman romantic fantasy in which he can somehow establish Turkish influence throughout the Middle East, and he thinks that by invading Syria he'll accomplish that. But it won't accomplish anything except to create more chaos.
And Tony, although throughout the last 8 years, Turkey's involvement in Syria has taken on different shapes and forms, do you think there is a cohesive strategy for Ankara in Syria? And if so, what do you think Ankara's ultimate, or even if not, what do you think at this point in the game Ankara's endgame or objective is in Syria?
Well, look, Erdogan has been incredibly reckless here. And we know that the Turks have been taking oil from Syria. They've basically just been opportunistically trying to grab resources. So, his tactic is simply, I think, number one, to aid the US NATO project to destabilize Syria, but also to grab as many resources as he can. I think it'd be interesting to look, because, of course, Turkey is ostensibly it is now anyway, a secular state with a sort of Islamic overtones, if you want. And I think it's worth comparing what happened in Iran to what happened in Turkey. So after World War I, we had Ataturk, who, by the way, was a Freemason, overturning the Islamic State and the old Ottoman Empire. So that was, in a way, similar to, so the way Turkey is today, and has been since then, is similar to Iran under the Shah. So it was a kind of sham version of Islam. And that, I think, is very important. What happened in Iran was that we had the revolution and we had a return to the Islamic moral values. That hasn't happened in Turkey. So what you've seen is a general drift toward the Western empires and toward the Western way of doing things, away from the moral high ground that used to be even in Turkey. Actually, in the old Ottoman days, there was at least this pretext of what we're doing is a moral mission based on the Quran. Of course, that is no longer the case there, even though there are some sort of similarities with those two countries. So a secular state, I'm afraid, it seems as if money is really all that matters now, and they have a very difficult balancing act between the Russians and NATO in Turkey. And it seems to me what we're seeing over the last few years since the attempted coup is a bit of both. So Erdogan will try and negotiate with the NATO countries on the one hand, and then with the Russians on the other. And that, I'm afraid, is not a very good. But there is another side to all of this, and that is this attempt to balkanize the Middle East. And this is originally the Yinon plan, the Israeli Yinon plan, and we've seen, haven't we, also arbitrary Israeli strikes on Syria, just as now we're seeing these Turkish strikes in Syria and the Turkish armed forces there in Syria. And that balkanization was put together in June 2006 in the US Armed Forces Journal by Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters. He talked about the new Middle East. They wanted to balkanize and break up the Middle East. That's exactly what Erdogan now is facilitating. So maybe that is his plan. He's looking at this US plan to balkanize the Middle East too, to cooperate with the United States. They were talking then about a new state being created called a Free Kurdistan, which maybe still might happen. Maybe Erdogan is working towards that as well. They wanted to divide Iraq up into two countries, a Sunni Iraq and a Shia Iraq. And this may be, in the back of Erdogan's mind as he's doing this as a sort of pretext to redraw the borders, very much like the French and the British did at the end of the First World War.
And Daniel, I'm going to let you give the closing thoughts in. What do you think, Ankara's, if you could weigh in on that same question, that ultimately Ankara's end game is, and do you think Erdogan is acting on behalf of Erdogan alone, or do you think he's doing some of NATO's bidding, considering Syrian army has practically cleansed all Syrian territory, won it back from foreign backed militancy? Do you think this is one last ditch effort to try to get NATO drawn back into Syria?
Well, first of all, I don't quite agree with the previous analysis. I think that Erdogan is indeed that Ataturk was in some ways comparable to the Shah, the Pahlavi dynasty, but that Erdogan is essentially a kind of a neo-Islamist, and in some ways comparable to the Islamic Republic in Iran. And I think what's motivating him now is some kind of a neo-Ottoman and neo-Islamic romantic fantasy about extending Turkish influence throughout the Middle East and even into northern Africa in Libya. So that's how I see him. I see him as a neo-Ottoman, neo-Islamist trying to extend his control over the broader region. As to what his end game is, it's difficult to say. He's a nihilist. He's at the end of his rope. His economy is doing very poorly. His political support is disappearing beneath his feet. He's hoping to win some great victory, which will shore up his power, but it never works. It always ends in failure, and it'll end in failure in this case as well.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. Time has gotten the better of us. I want to thank you both for joining us. Daniel Lazaire from New York and Mr. Tony Gosling there joining us out of Bristol. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.